This evening the discussion has moved far beyond the realm of economic sanctions. A statement resonated like a crack of thunder across the waters of the Persian Gulf. An entire civilization faces its end tonight. This represents perhaps the most harrowing admonition ever delivered by a modern American leader. Yet what exactly precipitated this abrupt transition from high tension to the precipice of utter destruction? Does this represent a masterstroke of geopolitical posturing, or are the missile hatches already sliding open? To grasp the true weight of this hour, one must look underneath the media frenzy and into the guarded halls of authority where this deadliest warning was conceived. For if the dawn breaks over a transformed planet tomorrow morning, this precise sequence of events marks the beginning of that change. For many decades, the bond between DC and Tehran has functioned as a slow-burning fuse. However, within the previous 24 hours, that spark has finally reached the explosives. To comprehend why Donald Trump would invoke the concept of civilization, a word that suggests the complete liquidation of a culture, a community, and a legacy, one must analyze the intelligence briefings that reached his desk at 3 in the morning. The mystery of the Fordow vaults. The narrative commences in the shadows. Deep beneath the rock of the Fordow Mountains, the vibration of centrifuges has escalated to a frequency that the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, can no longer overlook. For a long duration, the red line was defined as 90% enrichment, the critical point for nuclear weaponry. According to high-ranking informants, Iran did not merely reach that boundary, they erased it entirely. The traditional playbook of global statecraft has always operated on the premise that Iran remains months away from a breakthrough. But what if the hourglass ran out while the international community was distracted elsewhere? Trump's admonishment implies that the American intelligence apparatus has identified something, perhaps a miniaturized device or a successful non-nuclear test, that pivots the strategy from containment to national survival. Presidential strategy, peace through power or absolute conflict. The foreign policy of Donald Trump has consistently functioned as a departure from the norm. He is the leader who walked with Kim Jong-un at the DMZ, yet he is simultaneously the commander who authorized the elimination of Qasem Soleimani. His verbal volleys are his most potent instruments. By invoking the death of a civilization, he is implementing a philosophy of extreme deterrence. In this segment of the narrative, we observe the psychological operations currently in motion. Trump is aware that the leadership in Tehran perceives their conflict as a multi-generational game of chess. By putting the civilization itself at risk, he is attempting to knock the board over completely. He is communicating to the Ayatollahs that this is no longer a localized struggle over proxies in Yemen or Iraq. This is an existential peril directed at the very heart of Persian soil, the international arena. While the United States and Iran stand as the primary protagonists, the stage is heavily occupied. Israel's Mossad has been functioning within the dark, reportedly disrupting logistical chains, while Riyadh observes the situation with intense anxiety. If America initiates a move, the entirety of the Middle East will catch fire. But why at this moment? Why on this particular day? Our deep dive uncovers a string of ghost vessels within the Strait of Hormuz, oil tankers with deactivated tracking systems, navigating in patterns that imply a maritime blockade is being assembled. Should Iran obstruct the strait, 20% of global petroleum supplies disappear. The world economy would not merely enter a downturn, it would face a total breakdown. Trump's declaration serves as a preemptive strike against that economic ruin. He is elevating the stakes to such a height that any maneuver by Tehran would be interpreted as a literal suicide mission. Domestic turmoil. Within the borders of Iran, the social climate is a pressure cooker. Economic penalties have caused deep wounds, yet the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, remains obstinate. They have constructed a network of subterranean cities, immense tunnel systems stocked with long-range missiles. They operate under the conviction that they are beyond reach. Trump's linguistic escalation is tailored to destroy that feeling of invulnerability. He is addressing the Iranian citizenry and the military hierarchy directly, indicating that the defensive shield provided by their deep earth bunkers will fail to preserve the heritage of their state if a specific boundary is breached. The invisible assassins of the Persian Gulf. As twilight descended across the Arabian Sea, the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group did not merely hold its station, it transitioned to emission control. In the theater of contemporary maritime combat, a carrier strike group vanishing from the airwaves is far more menacing than one broadcasting its presence. It signifies that the mission parameters and target data have already been synchronized. However, the threat extends beyond the surface vessels visible to the naked eye. Deep below the waves, the invisible assassins, Ohio-class guided missile submarines, had previously assumed tactical positions within the profound canyons of the Indian Ocean. Each vessel is armed with 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Should the command be executed, this submarine fleet by itself possesses the capability to deconstruct Iran's total electrical grid, its internal communications, and its entire aerial defense network in under 20 minutes, all while ensuring not one American aviator has to cross into Iranian territory. The fortress breaker philosophy. The president's admonition pointedly alluded to civilization, a reference to the profound cultural identity and historical legacy that Iran holds dear. To substantiate this threat, the Department of Defense allegedly greenlit the deployment of the GBU-57A-B Massive Ordnance Penetrator, MOP. This is no ordinary explosive device. This is a 30,000-pound behemoth engineered for a singular objective: to penetrate the impenetrable. It remains the sole conventional weapon in the global stockpile capable of boring through 200 feet of hardened, steel-reinforced concrete. By relocating these assets to regional logistics centers like Diego Garcia, the notification to Tehran was unmistakable. Your subterranean missile citadels and the buried atomic laboratories at Natanz have ceased to be safe havens. They have become sepulchres. The virtual battlefield, evolution of Nitro Zeus. Contemporary combat is defined by more than just kinetic blasts. It is defined by the total failure of the power grid. As a component of this most lethal ultimatum, clandestine sources indicate that a significant cyber payload was triggered. Identified in certain intelligence communities as the spiritual heir to Stuxnet, this digital pathogen was engineered to remain hidden within Iran's essential civilian systems, including water purification facilities, urban transit controls, and the central financial markets. The presidential language hinted that a civilization will perish. This implies the absolute disintegration of the mechanisms that sustain a modern society. By menacing the nation with the ability to deactivate its digital infrastructure, the United States was demonstrating that it could forcibly revert the territory to the 19th century without launching a single physical projectile. The countermove from the lion's den. The leadership in Tehran did not meet this with silence. As the midnight chronometer advanced, the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, deployed their transportable Hajj Qasim ballistic projectiles into the Semnan wilderness. These delivery systems are capable of striking every American installation throughout the territory and reaching targets as distant as southeastern Europe. The narrative here is not exclusively one of American hostility. It describes a high-stakes standoff of mutual brinkmanship. Iran's forward defense doctrine relies on its network of affiliates, Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthi movement in Yemen. The instant the president broadcasted the warning, encrypted communications surged between Tehran and Beirut. The international community stood by to witness if the circle of fire surrounding Israel would be sparked as a retaliatory gesture. The 3 a.m. communication that remained silent. In the shadows of the crisis, the direct line established for conflict resolution stayed dormant. Typically, during periods of intense friction, intermediary nations such as Oman or Qatar serve as the diplomatic couriers for ultimatums and negotiations. Yet, in this instance, those avenues of communication were obstructed. The presidential tactic was to generate a vacuum of intel. By declining to elaborate on the particulars of the civilization remark, he compelled the Iranian high command into a condition of strategic hysteria. When an adversary's exact intentions remain a mystery, you are forced to prepare for every conceivable scenario, and attempting to defend against everything is the most efficient path to draining your assets and crushing your spirit. The mental strain on international commerce. As the civilization ultimatum reached the trading hubs in London and Tokyo, the valuation of Brent crude oil initiated a steep vertical ascent. For the common observer following these developments on digital platforms, this transcends a mere chronicle of combat. It is a narrative directly impacting their fuel expenditures, grocery, bills, and long-term security. The deadliest warning functioned as much as a financial cudgel as it did a martial one. By menacing a primary petroleum exporter with absolute liquidation, the administration was effectively utilizing the global marketplace as collateral to coerce Tehran into returning to the diplomatic forum. The account proceeds to chronicle the go-no-go procedural audits being executed by B-2 Spirit stealth crews and the clandestine withdrawal of non-essential staff from diplomatic missions throughout the Middle East. The Muscat conduit, the confidential correspondence. During the depths of the night, a modest, nondescript private aircraft touched down in Muscat. This did not represent a martial maneuver. It was the final opportunity for a diplomatic resolution. Evidence has since surfaced that a high-ranking messenger transported a manual missive, not on formal government stationery, but on a simple sheet of paper, delivered straight to the Sultan of Oman for immediate transmission to Tehran. The substance of that correspondence provided the bite behind the public rhetoric. It reportedly detailed the grid of no return. This was not merely a directory of military installations. It was a cartographic rendering of Iran's essential cultural landmarks, its financial core, and its command and control bunkers. The ultimatum was unmistakable. Should you act, the Iran of the present day will be relegated to a historical footnote by the following morning. This was the precise instant the deadliest warning manifested as a physical certainty for the authorities in Tehran. The orbital anomaly. As the friction mounted to its zenith, Persian military leaders observed a chilling phenomenon. Their indigenous reconnaissance satellites and GPS-reliant arrays began to stutter. For a brief interval, the entirety of the Iranian telecommunications web went silent. This was no mechanical malfunction. It was a signal demonstration orchestrated by the United States. By temporarily obscuring the vision of the Iranian Defense Forces, America proved that the civilization could be deactivated before a solitary projectile ever exited its launch tube. It served as a cybernetic exhibition of absolute hegemony. For the IRGC, this was a sobering realization. They were engaged in a high-stakes confrontation against a rival capable of altering the parameters of reality instantaneously. The limit at the strait. The genuine trigger for the civilization remark, per confidential sources, was a clandestine Iranian strategy to saturate the Strait of Hormuz with explosives using low observable drones. U.S. reconnaissance had intercepted subsurface acoustic echoes indicating that these naval mines were already being positioned. Had those devices been detonated, the planet's energy lifelines would have been strangled, potentially ushering in an international dark age. The presidential warning was the strategic parry. He was not merely protecting a boundary, he was safeguarding the international status quo. In this segment, we scrutinize the haunting rationale of preemptive eradication, the theory that a threat must be totally neutralized to avert a worldwide disaster. The standoff. The Supreme Command and the executive in Tehran, the Supreme Leader convened a crisis meeting of the Supreme National Security Council. The internal conflict was intense. Various commanders advocated for an absolute response, discharging the entire ballistic inventory to saturate American Aegis interceptor systems. Conversely, others contemplated the satellite imagery of B-2 bombers undergoing aerial refueling over the Atlantic and grasped that the U.S. was discarding the conventional rules of engagement. This was not a situation involving measured retaliation. The civilization admonition signaled that the United States was prepared to bypass surgical strikes and proceed directly to the final sequence. This mental strain began to produce rifts within the Iranian high command. For the first time in a generation, the ultra-conservatives were being urged to retreat by their own colleagues. The 11-hour hesitation. Precisely as the civilization reached the edge of an unimaginable catastrophe, a solitary communication was returned via the Swiss embassy. This was not a formal capitulation, but rather a strategic intermission. Tehran consented to withdraw its maritime forces from the strait and permitted an international oversight committee to examine the unstable nuclear facilities. The deadliest warning had achieved its goal, at least momentarily. The civilization remark by the president will be recorded in the annals of history as one of the most perilous yet successful instances of political rhetoric ever employed. It represented a wager of universal significance. Had Iran yielded, the global status quo would remain. Had they stood firm, the world would have been rendered unrecognizable. The consequences, a permanently altered reality. Despite the fact that no projectiles were launched that evening, the civilization ultimatum fundamentally transformed the character of international influence. It demonstrated that in the contemporary era, the most formidable armament is not an explosive, it is the plausible threat of absolute annihilation. As dawn broke over both Tehran and Washington, the immediate peril receded, yet the specter of the civilization endured. Every global power observed the shift. The period of restricted combat had concluded. We have transitioned into the epoch of absolute existential deterrence, the wall of humanity tactic. As dusk settled over the Iranian capital, a phenomenon unprecedented in the history of modern combat began to take shape. Thousands, and eventually tens of thousands of Iranian nationals started congregating toward the nation's vital infrastructure, beneath the towering silhouette of the Karun 3 dam and the expansive Bushehr atomic site. Everyday citizens, scholars, merchants, and senior citizens linked arms to create immense human barriers. They are wagering their existences against the president's verbal threats. They are challenging the ethical steadfastness of the planet's most dominant military force. For the first time, the civilization that was threatened with erasure is staring back at the commander-in-chief, not through the sensors of a missile, but through the collective gaze of its populace. The dilemma for the executive branch has shifted beyond tactical goals. It now centers on whether a global titan is prepared to strike through a barricade of human lives. The logistical fracture analysis. Why focus on transit points? Why energy hubs? In this segment of the narrative, we examine the harrowing rationale of systemic immobilization. By aiming for the spans across the Karun River and the locomotive arteries of Isfahan, the U.S. is not merely seeking a tactical victory, they are attempting to paralyze an entire country. Should the bridges collapse, the Iranian armed forces lose their mobility. Should the electrical stations fail, the subterranean cities lose their vital systems. The administration's plan is to fracture the nation into a collection of disconnected enclaves incapable of dialogue, movement, or defiance. It represents a 21st-century blockade, a civilization-scale deactivation that aims for the structural framework of the country rather than its core. The Digital Command Center. While the Department of Defense maintains total silence, the international community is deriving its strategic updates from Truth Social. The president's digital updates have transformed into the official dispatches of the conflict. I have no desire for this to occur, but it is likely, he posted only moments ago. This constitutes raw conflict. There are no media representatives to mitigate the impact. The mental toll on the Iranian financial system has already reached a disastrous level. The rial has devalued to the point where it is effectively worthless. In the bazaars of Tabriz, the population has abandoned currency in favor of trading gold and pharmaceuticals. The civilization is already undergoing an economic expiration before the first strike has even occurred, the illusion of political transformation. In a startling strategic pivot, the president's recent dispatches have begun to describe a revolutionarily wonderful future. He asserts that a complete and total regime change has already manifested within the collective consciousness of the Iranian populace. This represents a classic bifurcated strategy, menacing the ruling elite with absolute destruction, while simultaneously presenting the great people of Iran with a gateway to a prosperous new age. However, does this reflect a tangible reality or a strategic mirage? Investigations indicate that while the boulevards are teeming with human blockades, the IRGC has not retreated. Reports suggest they have concealed Sizzler cruise missiles within civilian cargo containers. The smarter minds alluded to by the president may refer to a clandestine military faction seeking a de-escalation path, or it could be a calculated maneuver to incite internal subversion. The papal supplication and the international vigil. As the 8 p.m. cutoff approaches, the global stage has expanded further. Pope Leo XIV has initiated an emergency call for prayer, characterizing the current impasse as the closest humanity has come to the Great Tribulation in modern times. From the halls of the Vatican to the thoroughfares of New York City, the world exists in a state of shared psychological trauma. This has transcended regional friction to become a global existential milestone. Should the administration execute its threat on Power Plant Day, the ecological and humanitarian consequences will ignore national boundaries, contaminating Iraqi water sources and destabilizing European energy sectors. The civilization at stake is no longer localized to Iran. it is the global civilization of stability. The ultimate countdown. The world is now entering the information blackout zone. In the coming hours, the lights of Tehran will either remain illuminated as a testament to a diplomatic breakthrough, or they will be extinguished in a burst of kinetic force that will fundamentally redefine the planet. Aviators of the 509th Bomb Wing are strapped into their cockpits. Iranian missile batteries have reached launch authorization status, and the global public remains transfixed by their mobile devices, awaiting the next social media update, the next breaking headline, or the initial reports of detonation. The Smarter Minds resolution. While the international gaze was fixed on the millions of Iranians encircling their energy facilities, a confidential transmission was received on a high-security terminal within the Situation Room. The earlier digital posts regarding complete and total regime change and the prevailing of smarter minds were not mere theater, they were coded signals. In the shadows, a specific branch of the Iranian defense establishment, dreading the literal death of their civilization, reportedly initiated contact through Pakistani and Omani conduits. This was not a total surrender, but it offered the concessions the U.S. demanded: the immediate and unrestricted reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, alongside a permanent cessation of nuclear enrichment. The revolutionarily wonderful outcome teased by the president proved to be a final-hour diplomatic phenomenon. A regression averted? For several hours, the idiot skies above Tehran echoed with the roar of jet propulsion, yet the massive ordnance penetrators remained secured in their bays. The 8 p.m. deadline elapsed, and rather than the horizon being set ablaze by the destruction of power grids, a different luminescence appeared, the glow of millions of mobile screens across the country as news spread of a strategic accord. The gamble on extreme deterrence had pushed humanity to the very edge of the precipice, only to retrieve it at the ultimate moment. Detractors may label it a war crime that was narrowly avoided. Proponents will herald it as the most significant diplomatic achievement in the history of statecraft. But for the citizens standing on the spans in courage and calm, it was simply the night they were permitted to live. The global judgment, a novel geopolitical order. The civilization did not expire this evening, but the world, as we knew it certainly did. The occurrences of April 7, 2026 have established a radical new precedent. The Trump doctrine has demonstrated that by menacing the absolute entirety of a sovereign state's existence, one can circumvent years of stagnant diplomacy in a single night. Nevertheless, the psychological and economic scars endure. The international marketplace continues to reel from the vertical spikes in petroleum pricing, and the foundational trust between world powers has reached a historic nadir. Iran has endured the storm, but its essential infrastructure is battered, and its collective psyche is permanently altered. As the sun ascends on Wednesday, the international community is left with a haunting question: what occurs the next time the countdown reaches midnight? The closing cycle. We commenced this journey with a ticking chronometer and an admonition that chilled the blood of every individual on the planet. We have witnessed the exhibition of military supremacy, the formation of human barricades, and the clandestine correspondence that moved through the shadows. Donald Trump informed us that 47 years of extortion, corruption, and death would conclude tonight. Whether it has truly reached a finale, or if we have merely pressed pause on a far more significant detonation, only the passage of time will clarify. But tonight, the lights within Tehran remain illuminated. The bridges continue to span the rivers, and for the time being, the whole civilization survives to witness another dawn. The civilian barrier philosophy. Why focus on river crossings? Why target energy facilities? In this portion of our narrative, we scrutinize the harrowing rationale of functional immobilization. Earlier today, the IDF already broadcasted a warning for the Iranian public to avoid rail travel, and kinetic strikes have reportedly already impacted Karg Island, the nation's most indispensable oil terminal. The global judgment on war crimes. As the 8:12 p.m. cutoff nears, international heads of state are sounding the alarm. From the United Nations to the French Foreign Ministry, the warning is unambiguous. Aiming at civilian power facilities and transit bridges could constitute a violation of the laws of war. When questioned by journalists regarding these legal concerns, Trump's reaction was characteristically blunt. You know what's a war crime? Possessing a nuclear weapon. He is not concerned with international jurisprudence. He is focused on the midnight clock. As the world observes, the civilization at risk is not merely Iran's, it is the established global order of international law. The planet did not merely watch the seconds tick away on the night of April 7, 2026. It witnessed the conclusion of an era. As the 8 p.m. Eastern deadline arrived, the atmosphere over the Middle East was heavy with the resonance of jet engines. This was the instant the deadliest warning was intended to transform into the final strike. The midnight operation on Karg Island. While the world anticipated the 8 p.m. deadline, the kinetic conflict had already commenced. Verifications emerged that U.S. and Israeli forces had already neutralized military assets on Karg Island, the absolute center of Iran's oil-based economy. This was not a warning, it was a decapitation of the administration's financial lifeblood. Orbital reconnaissance captured the terrifying radiance of the petrochemical center in Shiraz and the railway span in Kashan as they were reduced to debris. Trump's Bridge Day was not a literary device. By eliminating the BDCE, Yahya Abad Rail Bridge, the U.S. military effectively severed the Iranian logistical web in half, leaving the IRGC's mobile missile unit stranded in the wilderness. The Smarter Minds resolution, but then, something revolutionarily wonderful, using the president's own terminology, began to emerge from the Situation Room. Amidst the plumes of smoke rising from Karg Island, a clandestine agreement was being negotiated. The Truth Social post regarding complete and total regime change was not merely an ultimatum, it was a signal that a faction within the Tehran hierarchy, the Smarter Minds, had finally grasped that the alternative was the total erasure of their national legacy. While 14 million Iranians stood as human barriers around energy hubs, a confidential 10-point proposal was undergoing review. Iran offered to reopen the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for an immediate cessation of hostilities. The civilization did not perish tonight because, at the very final minute, the pressure of total annihilation compelled a pivot that decades of conventional diplomacy failed to produce. The final verdict, the Trump Doctrine. As the sun ascends on April 8th, the international community is left to reconstruct the fragments of a shattered global order. Critics characterize the civilization warning as a violation of every international standard, a rhetorical war crime. Yet, for the adherents of the Trump Doctrine, the outcomes are self-evident. The strait is reopening, the atomic centrifuges are slowing, and a catastrophic war was avoided by standing on the very precipice of it. The global economy, however, remains in a state of profound shock. The IEA has already classified this as the most severe energy crisis in human history, exceeding the impacts of 1973 and 1979 combined. Even without a full-scale war, the mere threat of terminating a civilization has cast the world into a financial depression that will require years of recovery. We began this journey with a chilling admonition from the Oval Office. We witnessed a nation transform its own citizens into human shields, and a president redefine the parameters of global conflict via a social media application. Trump informed the world that 47 years of extortion, corruption, and death would conclude tonight. Whether this represents an enduring peace or merely a brief intermission in a much larger fragmentation,